Relations between Jordan's Palestinians and its Jordanians have always been one of this country's most sensitive issues. But it is an especially touchy subject nowadays, because if there is to be peace, there will also be enormous changes in this poor country. And both peoples stand to win or lose from the changes. With falling trade barriers, whole sectors of the economies of Jordan, Israel, and the West Bank may flourish or vanish. The region's resources are few and the people many. Overtaxed rivers can barely keep the farmlands green or the glasses full. There are too many mouths feeding off this parched landscape. And so, one of the most crucial questions in Jordan today is who will stay and who will go. How many Palestinians will be allowed to return to the West Bank? How many will want to? And how many will be welcome in tomorrow's Jordan? On the streets and in front of the TV cameras, people play down the problem.
And Palestine and Jordan never felt that the big difference between each other. They are only one big family.
We like the Palestinian people, and we want them to stay in our country.
But in private, both peoples worry.
Normally, Jordanians and Palestinians speak differently when they are alone than when they are mixed. When they are mixed, they speak a different language.
To many Jordanians, Palestinians have always meant instability and political intrigue. Palestinians say they are never sure they are welcome in Jordan, that they still lack a fair share of political power. To discuss the issue, CNN met with two outspoken commentators on Jordanian affairs. Fahad al-Fanik is what may be called a Jordanian nationalist. Some even say his articles in Jordan's main newspapers are extreme. Labib Kamhawi is also a Jordanian, but one born in Palestine.
It is a kind of forbidden topic. Nobody should discuss it. Everybody should know about it, but not discuss it, really.
He is also known to speak out on subjects most people only discuss with friends. Both men are on opposite sides of the spectrum, and they disagree on almost everything.
I think the Palestinians are 65% of the population of Jordan.
Jordan was always Jordan, but it has a lot of Palestinians. Something like 40% of the population are from Palestinian origin, but they are legally Jordanians.
The king himself is not Jordanian.
What is
he? He's a Hijazi. Who is a Jordanian? Ma'an and Aqaba was incorporated Jordan only less than half a century ago. Who is a Jordanian? Who are these guys who are talking like this?
The identity of Jordan, the fact that Jordan is not a statistical problem. Even if the Palestinians are any percentage, Jordan remains a country for the Jordanians, and the Palestinians remain refugees and guests in another Arab country.
You cannot really say that because the land was lost, the Palestinians ceased to have any rights in the country and they become an unwelcome guest. This is also not acceptable, because when the land was lost, the Palestinians were partners and they were citizens of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
As successive wars broke the promise of these lands, waves of Palestinians fled across the river to the East Bank, in other words, to Jordan. How many will return to Palestine?
There is no practical possibility that all Palestinians will leave. The question is only whether the refugees in the camps will return or not. And their return would be positive on Jordan, because the refugees are a burden and not a contributing factor to the economy.
Quite to the contrary, the Jordanian economy flourished at the expense of Palestinian misery. Jordan was able to get huge amounts of money in the form of assistance, because it harbors so many hundreds of thousands of refugees.
As soon as we have a Palestinian state or entity where the Palestinians can go to, then we have no problem, because in that case anyone would either become Jordanian and forget about Palestine, or if he insists on his rights in Palestine, he has the choice to return there.
This is the crux of the problem. Everybody wants you to be anti-Palestinian just to prove your loyalty to Jordan and to the fact that you are Jordanian. And we have been fighting against this philosophy up till now. There is no contradiction with it. Absolutely. Quite to the contrary. I mean, Jordan and Palestine have always been one thing.
Some would say the tensions between Jordan's two main ethnic groups are typical of any mixed society. But the fact is, East Banker and West Banker have never had the chance to sort out their differences in the give and take of a democracy without war. In other words, a difficult process has only just begun. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Amman. This is the road that brings trade from the West Bank. Traffic is light these days. These men are bringing Palestinian vegetable oil to Jordanian markets. They say there is less business, not more, since Jordan and Israel signed their peace treaty. This is a first on Jordanian television, an advertisement for chocolate from the West Bank town of Ramallah. The only problem is, these sweets have yet to make it to the candy counters of Jordan. The reason is that lately relations have been rocky between Jordan and the Palestine Authority. Last week, Yasser Arafat arrived in Amman with his cabinet in tow to sign some basic agreements on how the two nations will live side by side. A top advisor to Jordan's King Hussein says last week's meeting was long overdue.
Well, let us say that we should have been able to reach more solid grounds way before last week.
One reason is that King Hussein and Yasser Arafat have always had trouble trusting each other. The Palestinian leader is said to believe that the king has his eye on Palestinian turf. Jordanian leaders say they worked hard during recent negotiations to put such fears to rest.
It took some time for some negative impressions in the minds of our brethren within the PNA to overcome that Jordan has no designs and no attempts to have a hegemony over anyone.
Critics say last week's accords had more to do with selling peace to their peoples than actually mending fences between the two leaders.
Both of them need some measure of positive improvement just to try and cover for their inability to deliver anything to their people.
For now, their constituents are in limbo, waiting for the commerce, the travel, the communications they were promised to fall into place. It may be natural for Palestinians and Jordanians to have the closest of ties, but the people can't get on with their lives until the leaders iron out their differences. The recent Palestinian-Jordanian accords are supposed to change all that. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Amman. The loose alliance of Islamists, leftists, and others opposed to peace with Israel had been granted permission to rally. Overnight, however, the government changed its mind and offered no explanation. When the opposition decided to gather anyway, police and plainclothesmen were waiting and ordered the crowd to disperse.
People are not really accepting peace now because they feel that a lot has been given away for free to the Israelis. And on democracy, this today is an example as to the measure of democracy that the government is planning to allow.
Undercover police used threats and shoves to disperse the crowd. There were several scuffles. Some demonstrators were beaten. Television cameras were not welcome. They too were roughed up by undercover police. The Jordanian government says that its top two priorities in these times are making peace and building a democracy. On occasions like these, the two seem to be at odds with one another. But of those two goals, says Rami Khouri, it is clear which one is more important to the regime.
It's much more important for the government and the ruling political establishment to have a successful peace process and therefore economic revitalization than to have a Jeffersonian-type participatory democracy.
We think this is undemocratic, and we have the right as opposition parties to express our feelings towards what our people think.
Some of these same politicians have led the charge in professional guilds banishing members who meet with or speak to Israelis. That they demand the democratic rights to free assembly is considered ironic by some.
They probably would do the same thing if they were in government. They would want to have their views being the dominant views, and they would try to minimize opposition views. There's no question about that.
Khoury and many others say such rallies are a useful safety valve for public tensions and believe the government would be wiser to allow them than to ban them. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Amman. In Amman, the stock market nudges up one day and slips back the next. Peace is now 3 months old, and the expected economic boom has not materialized. Nothing's happening, says this greengrocer. No more buying or selling. The economy is going nowhere. We'll wait 6 months, a year, but the situation is bad for everybody. There is good reason why Jordanians got their hopes up last fall. Their leaders promised them prosperity, and so did the most powerful man in the world.
On behalf of the United States, we will not let you down.
3 months later, Israeli leaders were worried enough about the mood in Jordan to pay a hasty visit to King Hussein.
We are not blind. There is some sort of crisis of expectations.
Now the king's message to his people is, be patient, prosperity takes time. Many Jordanians want political reform, more democracy and less bureaucracy. Sensitive perhaps to the public mood, King Hussein recently chose a new cabinet for the new era. Many are skeptical.
People do not feel convinced that there is genuine intention to reform and improve things, because there is very little difference between this new administration, the new government, and the previous governments.
The second major influence on attitudes here is the "I told you so" factor. Israel is seen as breaking its promises, giving settlers free rein to grab more Palestinian land, while Jordan has kept its own opponents of peace under guard. And so people worry that they will look like dupes in the eyes of the Arab world. Jordanians seem disappointed on all sides, by Israel, by their own government, and by the Western nations that promised aid. The public wants immediate results, but those governments say they'll just have to be patient. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Amman. PLO chairman Yasser Arafat visited Jordan this week to meet with King Hussein. But he had another top priority, to mend fences with the Palestinian business community. Arafat's autocratic style has not gone down well with some of these men. They are among those who convinced him to accept publicly the existence of Israel and to take the road to Oslo. Today, they want a little more respect for the advice they have to offer. Arafat may have problems communicating in English, but in Arabic and among his own people, he is a master at working the crowd. He urged businessmen to bring their capital to Gaza and the West Bank. The Soviet Union was defeated by what, brothers? He said. By the economy. Businessmen say it was a much-needed pep talk.
I think in a way he concurred with us that there are problems, and he admitted that he is having himself problems, freeing our economy and giving us the freedoms to interact and react from the Israelis.
Investors say red tape in Egypt, Jordan, and especially Israel make it hard to do business in the West Bank.
The normal freedoms that are available for any economy in the world, we are not given that freedom by the Israelis because of their continuous poking, interference, and regulation.
If their job is to build an economy, Arafat's is to build an infrastructure. He blames his delays on the international community.
One of the most important leaders of the World Bank mentioned officially in Brussels that we don't want to look to the eyes of President Arafat because we had promised him to give him in the first year $720 million, which had been reduced to $400 million, which had been reduced to $240 million, which had been reduced to $125 million, and this $125 million had not arrived, all of it.
When Arafat showed off his new passport, the first Palestinian passport, it was a moment of truth for the audience. For them, it is all about building a country from scratch. To hear the Palestinians tell it, they are holding up their end of the bargain more than they've been given credit for. It is Israel and the neighboring Arab states, they say, who've got to learn to let go, to stop controlling the Palestinians and their economy as they have done for so many years. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Amman. Afternoon prayers and the voice of the muezzin arches over the busy streets of Amman. Muslims say this is the true face of Islam, God blended into every part of daily life. But some Muslims worry about the message of Islam today, that the loudest voices seem to preach more resentment than love, more dogma than tolerance. The question is, why are those the loudest voices? Where are all the moderates?
Liberty of thought in the Islamic world is very limited.
Many argue there are great moderate thinkers today, but then why don't they speak out as loudly as the hardliners?
There are people who stood for their, you see, opinions, and they met death. Many in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt.
Islamist scholars say it wasn't always so. Science, philosophy, and political debate once flourished in the Muslim world. And then in the 10th century, the Bab al-Ijtihad, the door of interpretation, was closed. Religious leaders said they knew all there was to know about the Quran, and believers should stop asking questions. Centuries later, many Islamic scholars believe the faith needs to give its freethinkers freer reign. Many scholars call today for the opening of the door of interpretation, says this professor. Out in the desert of North Jordan, an army barracks has recently been turned into an Islamic college. It is King Hussein's pet project, and he believes this institute may one day change the course of history in the Muslim world.
I believe it is a very, very important beginning in an area that is paramount importance to all of us in this region, but maybe in the world.
The classrooms are still almost empty. A smattering of students from Albania, Malaysia, and other countries mill in the recreation room. The idea is to teach freedom of speech and tolerance, modern Islam along with modern science, the traditions of the faith, as well as open debate. It is an ambitious task.
To be fanatic is very easy. But to be moderate, you have to work on it. You have to adapt yourself, to train yourself, to educate yourself to be moderate and to be tolerant.
Almost all Muslims, conservative, liberal, or fundamentalist, agree that the fire in the belly of today's religious extremists does not come from the past, but from the present. Social injustice begets deadly devotion. As you know, says Professor Sartawi, in many Muslim countries, the money has gone into the pockets of the rulers by the billions. How can the people not but listen to voices calling for the end of tyranny, the removal of tyrants, even by force? And so, when the moderates do speak out, the masses pay little attention. This is the dilemma for moderate Muslims. Democracy needs religious tolerance. Religious tolerance needs democracy. And so today, the moderates feel trapped, while the angry preacher and the corrupt government minister are in some ways the closest of allies. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Amman. Iraq's vast oil wealth has been called the world's last great prize. And oil men and women recently endured a grueling 12-hour trek across the desert to get a piece of it. They came to Baghdad looking for deals, if not for today, because the UN embargo forbids that, then for the future.
I'm here for just that reason, purely and simply to maintain friendly contacts with members of the Iraqi oil industry, so that at least they know who we are and we know who they are one day when sanctions come to an end.
Some were awkward about coming here with UN sanctions still in place, but the lure of all that oil is proving too great.
They can never ignore it. They can't ignore it. It's big. It's enormous.
Here, conversations in the hallways matter more than speeches in the auditorium. The temptations for the world's businessmen are great. Here lie the world's second largest proven reserves and an oil industry destroyed by war that will have to be rebuilt. And the Baghdad government talks of awarding $30 billion in contracts in the next 5 to 8 years alone. The Baghdad government hopes the world's appetite for oil will soon force the UN Security Council to lift sanctions. Some delegates agree.
There seems to be a consensus that the embargo is about to crumble away one way or another. That seems to be the belief amongst the businessmen and the hope, of course, amongst the Iraqis.
Few Americans attended the seminar. Those who came as journalists or consultants. American oilmen are prohibited by their own government from dealing with Iraq.
Certainly there are rumors that American businessmen have met, with Iraqis outside the country. Clearly they are definitely interested in Iraq as a market. One might even say they're salivating.
The oil minister says his government is happy to do business with American companies, but he issued a warning.
They will lose their business in the future if they will be continuing like this.
And the competition is ready. Iraq says it has already drawn up, but not signed, $15 billion in contracts. Top French oil companies, Elf and Total, are said to have secured rights to drill in 2 new, huge oil fields in southern Iraq, just as soon as sanctions are lifted.
We're opening the door to our competitors, who are here and who are trying and who will have probably their nose under the tent, literally.
CPC is from Taiwan. These people believe politics is one thing, business is another. The drillers, the geologists, and the investors are laying the groundwork for future profits. Stefan Kotsonis, CNN, Baghdad.